Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Okay, we continue now with the study of the Satipatthana Sutta. Okay, and we started on the section of contemplation of the body and the subsection on mindfulness of breathing. I just want to mention, as I mentioned last week, I'm going rather quickly through the Satipatthana Sutta rather than in great detail. But if somebody wants interested in a detailed study of the Satipatthana Sutta, I recommend a book by one Venerable Analayo. It's called Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization. It's a detailed study of the Satipatthana Sutta, section by section. Okay, now last time I dealt with section 4 of the sutta. This section explains the four stages in mindfulness of breathing, insofar as it is a contemplation of the body. Then, following this main section on the development of mindfulness of breathing, there comes an additional section, which is actually repeated with the appropriate modifications for each of the main exercises throughout the Satipatthana Sutta. So sometimes this is referred to as the refrain of the Satipatthana Sutta. Refrain in the sense of the way a song has a repeated passage that occurs after each main verse in the song. It's strange that the word refrain has the meaning of to abstain from. And then also it has the meaning of a repeated passage. How is there a connection between those two meanings? English is a strange language. Okay, so this refrain of the Satipatthana Sutta has the effect, we could say, of directing each exercise in the direction of insight or vipassana. So even when the main part of a particular exercise emphasizes tranquility or the calming of the mind, by attaching this refrain to the main exercise, it sort of shunts or shifts that exercise in the direction of insight or vipassana practice. Okay, so when we look at the refrain, we can also see that it is divided into 4 main subsections. We can call these main subsections of the refrain the internal and external dichotomy. Dichotomy means having 2 aspects. The second subsection is the arising and passing away subsection. The third is, we call this the bare knowledge and continued mindfulness subsection. And the fourth is the independent and non-clinging subsection. Okay, so now coming to the exercise for mindfulness of breathing, we see the refrain says, in this way, that is in regard to the practice of mindfulness of breathing, he dwells contemplating the body in the body internally. In Pali, this is ajatang. Or he dwells contemplating the body in the body externally, bahida. Or he dwells contemplating the body in the body both internally and externally. Okay, now in the practice of mindfulness of breathing, the main focus is on developing mindfulness of breathing internally. Because where does one experience the breath, one's own breath? Not externally, but it's always an internal or personal experience. Actually, the word which is translated internally is actually, in Pali, it's ajatang. Yeah, here this word ajatang is comprised of a prefix ati, which here has a sense of with reference to, and then atta is self, not in the sense of a metaphysical self, but the reflexive sense, oneself. So one is developing the mindfulness of breathing with reference to oneself, and in this way one is contemplating the body in the body. But then there comes the second aspect. He dwells contemplating the body in the body externally. Here, bahida means outside. And this word bahida is usually taken to refer to either the outer world or especially with reference to other people. In fact, in the case of breathing, it has to refer to other people or other sentient beings that have the capacity for breath. And this is a little bit puzzling, I have to say, because it raises the question, how does one contemplate the breathing externally with reference to other people? And I can't think of any of the meditation teachers that I know of who teach mindfulness of breathing, who emphasize or who include within their practice observing the breath in other people. And this becomes a little bit problematic because the same refrain occurs with reference to feelings and states of mind. So how does one experience the feelings of others and the states of mind of others unless one has developed these supernormal powers? But the Satipatthana Sutta or the practice in the Satipatthana Sutta is not being prescribed as a special exercise for those who've developed supernormal powers, but it's just being prescribed in a very general, comprehensive way. And so it must in some way be understood to be a kind of practice that anybody is capable of undertaking, not only those who develop the power of knowing the feelings of others, knowing the thoughts and mind states of others. Okay, so this is just the way I would understand it. It's my own conjecture, is that in the practice of mindfulness of breathing, the main emphasis is on developing the practice with regard to the experience of one's own breath. And it's on the basis of one's own breathing, attention to one's own breathing, that one can develop the gradual calming of the mind, even to the levels of jhana, meditative absorption. And also generally in developing insight, one develops insight with regard to one's own bodily processes. However, in order to gain, let's say, a more comprehensive understanding of how universal this process of breathing is, one can reflectively, just for a few moments within the course of developing insight, reflect upon the fact that the breath is an activity which is partaken of by all sentient beings or all beings above a certain level. And so in this way one gets a sense of the universality of breathing, how all living beings throughout this entire earth, presumably throughout all world systems, are breathing in and breathing out. Okay, and then the third phase of this exercise is bringing the two together, contemplating the body and the body, both internally and externally. The way the commentators explain this, they say that one alternates quickly back and forth between the experience of breath within oneself, or let's say the contemplation of breath within oneself, and then the contemplation of breath, breathing in others. And so one goes back alternating quickly from one to the other. But perhaps, again, this is my own conjecture, it should be understood that simultaneously one brings together in one's mind the sense of one's own breath and the breath of others. Of course, one could only feel one's own breath, but in a kind of reflective exercise, one unites the fact that oneself is breathing in and out, and all other living beings, or certain types of living beings, are breathing in and out. Okay, this is the way I would understand it, even though I have to say that the word anupassi, which is translated contemplating, almost always refers to something that one can directly experience, which would be the internal breath. So it's a little problematic, and I don't know how to resolve that problem. Okay, now this exercise of contemplating the body and the body internally, externally, and both, we could say that this gives, we might call this a spatial dimension to the contemplation of breathing, mindfulness of breathing. The next subphase shifts the emphasis towards the temporal or time-based observation of the breath. Because now one dwells contemplating, and here I have to explain how I translate this. He dwells contemplating in the body, its nature of arising, or he dwells contemplating in the body, its nature of vanishing, or he dwells contemplating in the body, its nature of both arising and vanishing. I'll write the important phrase here on the board. Yeah, I write this because there's some, I can't call this a controversy, but different ways of interpreting the Pali text. So kayasmin means in the body. Va simply means all. Then we have this compound, Samudaya dhammanupassi, with the verb viharati, he dwells. Okay, now some interpreters, and this seems to be based on the commentary, take this to mean he dwells contemplating in the body its factors of arising. They take samudaya dhamma to mean the factors of arising, the factors of origination. And then vaya dhammanupassi to mean contemplating the factors of vanishing. And then samudaya vaya dhammanupassi to mean contemplating the factors of arising and vanishing. But I understand it somewhat differently, and I found some support for this in other suttas, that here Dhamma doesn't mean factors, but means the nature, having the nature of arising, the nature of vanishing, the nature of arising and vanishing. Okay, according to this way of interpreting the phrase as factors of arising, what one does is to contemplate that the body originates from certain conditions. And since the focus of the body here is on the breath, one contemplates that the breathing originates in dependence upon certain conditions. And so, in order to dwell contemplating in the body its nature of arising, one contemplates that the breath originates in dependence upon the body itself, since without a body one could not breathe. It depends upon the nostrils, since without the nose there would not be any breath. It depends upon the presence of the mind, since if the mind were to be extinguished, there would be no breathing. We could say it also depends upon life or vitality, since without life, there would be no breathing. Okay, and then the vanishing, contemplating the factors of vanishing, one would contemplate that in the absence of the body, there would be no breath. In the absence of nostrils, there would be no breath. With the cessation of mind, there's no breathing. With the cessation of life or vitality, there's no breathing. Okay, this is the way it's explained, this phrase is explained in the commentary. But the way I understand it, this makes it too complicated. The way I understand it, what one contemplates is simply the origination from moment to moment of the breath. Or we could say the origination of material factors of the body together with the breath. And then one contemplates the vanishing moment by moment of the breath and these material factors. And so this brings one into a continuous contemplation of arising and passing away. And then in the third case, the third subphase within this section, one contemplates in the body its nature of both arising and vanishing. According to the commentarial way of explanation, this means one alternates quickly back and forth from arising to vanishing, from arising to vanishing. But it may be, this is the way one might interpret it, instead of taking them to be successive, at the same moment one is observing or contemplating that this body is subject to both origination and vanishing or cessation. We say that the body has the nature of both arising and vanishing. Okay, so this is the second subphase of this contemplation. Then the third subphase, the way I understand it, here one is no longer making an intentional effort to distinguish different aspects of bodily experience, whether internal or external, whether arising or vanishing. But at this point, the contemplation has gained such force that one just sets up the simple awareness while breathing, the simple awareness that there is the body. So one is now just observing the body as this physical phenomena. And since the awareness, the mindfulness is very strong, one is able to discern the body as this mass or assemblage of processes which are constantly arising and vanishing, even though one is not specifically focusing in on the aspect of arising or vanishing. But one is just observing the body as a physical phenomena. But in that act of observation, the constant arising and passing away is evident. And so one simply establishes the mindfulness, there is a body, and by establishing that mindfulness, that is sufficient for knowledge and continued or sustained mindfulness to occur. This is a result of what I would call the momentum of continuous practice, that in the stages of building up the practice, one has to make the effort first to be mindful, then to calm down the mind. Then when the mind is calm, one makes the effort to investigate from different angles. But then once all of these acts or activities have built up their momentum, then one no longer has to make the strong, deliberate, intentional effort, but one simply, for example, sits down and establishes the mindfulness, the recognition, there is the body, and then immediately the mind settles down calmly on the body. And in that calmness, the observation becomes very clear and very continuous, and that serves as the basis for the arising of this flow of insight knowledge and this continuity of mindfulness. Okay, so this is the third phase. And then the fourth phase, we could say, shows the result of this practice. But we could say maybe this is the mode in which one sustains the practice. That is, he dwells independent, not clinging to anything in the world. This shows that as one is dwelling in this way, one is free from craving and attachment, and through that freedom from craving and attachment, one is able to dwell independent. One's mind is not attached to anything. And then that is how one dwells contemplating the body and the body. Okay, maybe at this point I will invite any questions on this section of the sutta. Yes, forward.
Is it possible to interpret the body, internal body as the six sensations, and the body externally as the object of the six sensations?
Wait. The body internally as
the six faculties.
six sense faculties.
And
And the body externally as the objects.
the object and the internal and external as the content. And then what follows is to contemplate the five faculties as a result of the.
I can't hear so well. I wonder, do we have the other microphone here? We should have the other microphone. Okay.
It's okay, I can speak now.
Okay, you cup your hands, yeah.
My question is about the interpretation of the word body. Does it have to refer to the physical body, or is it possible to refer to the five sense faculties and
Yeah.
the internal body, and when one contemplates the body externally, that refers to the object of the five sense faculties, and the body internally and externally refers to the context.
Yeah, this introduces it's an interesting problem which would come up for somebody who knows Pali, because there's another pair of terms, I erased, Ajatika Bahira. Let me put it this way. Okay, there are two different pairs which seem to be similar. One is the pair Ajatang Bahida. That's what we have in the sutta. And here, Ajatang is almost always taken to refer to oneself, and Bahida to refer to the outer world, particularly other persons, other beings. Then there's a second pair, which is Ajatika Bahira. It's actually based on the same words, but the form is a little different. And here, Ajatika refers to the sense faculties. the 5 sense faculties, actually the 6 sense faculties, including the mind. And Bahira refers to the objects of the 6 sense faculties. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the pair used is Ajatang Bahida, not Ajatika Bahira. And the two are not identical. For example, his sense faculties would be, from my point of view, Bahida. They're external. But from anybody's point of view, they have to be Ajatika. They're always Ajatika. The color of my skin, the sound of my voice is always, I have to get this right. From my point of view, it's always Ajatang, internal, even though from any point of view it's Bahira, because these are sense objects. Okay, since in the Satipatthana Sutta, the pair that we're dealing with is Ajatang Bahida, it has to be understood as Ajatang is what refers to oneself, and Bahida what is external to oneself. So it's not the same as the distinction of the internal sense faculties and the external sense objects. Did I catch your point? Because some teachers use a different way of explaining this distinction. For example, the modern Indian Vipassana teacher Goenka, he teaches to contemplate internally means that, the way he explains the distinction, whether it's internal or external, it's always referring to oneself, one's own body. But when one contemplates externally, then one is contemplating the sankharas, the formations, the sensations connected with the breath at an external level of the body. And then as one goes deeper and deeper into the body, then it turns into contemplating internally. So he sees the distinction between, is relating to one's own body, but between contemplating close to the surface of the body and then contemplating the sensations deep within the body. Other teachers say that when you're in a relatively shallow stage of practice, then one is contemplating externally. But as the process goes deeper and deeper, then they call this contemplating internally. But these seem to be, we call these modern attempts to make sense out of a rather puzzling passage in the text. Does anybody have any other ideas about this? How does he explain? Okay, then should we go on then to the next? Okay, now we'll go on to the other stages in the contemplation of the body, the other practices. Okay, the next one now is called the contemplation of the 4 postures. So there are 4 main postures. This is the Indian way of analyzing the movement of the body. 4 main postures that the body can assume. One is walking, moving. The next is standing still. The third is sitting. And then the 4th is lying down. And then there are different other postures that the body can assume, which are somewhat halfway steps between these main postures. So these are covered by the phrase, however his body is disposed. Okay, so now when practicing this foundation of mindfulness, contemplation of the body, then when one is engaged in any of these postures, one understands or one knows that one is engaged in that particular posture. When walking, one knows one is walking. When one stops and stands still, one knows one is standing still. When sitting, one knows one is sitting. When lying down, one knows one is lying down. And then if the body is in any condition in between these postures, then one knows the body in that particular midway posture. Now the way this particular exercise, the primary way it gets applied in the actual systematic practice of meditation is through the practice of walking meditation. And this is used as an alternating practice in between periods of sitting meditation. Since, except for those who are very advanced, one can't just sit continuously for hours on end. But when developing the practice, the periods of sitting meditation are broken up with periods of walking meditation. And in the Satipatthana Sutta itself, all that is said of the walking meditation is that when one is walking, one knows I am walking. But within the lineages or traditions of Theravada meditation, there are different ways in which teachers teach the walking meditation. A very simple way, let's call this the simplest level, is when walking back and forth, one simply knows each step as it occurs. When taking a right step, one follows the whole right step from the moment of lifting the foot, bringing it forward, putting it down. One doesn't break it up into different phases, but one just follows the entire movement of the foot with the right step, then with the left step. And so one has this mindfulness and awareness, continuous, or mindfulness and clear comprehension, continuous through the whole act of walking. Right step alternating with left step, right alternating with left, right with left, through the entire course of walking. In order to practice the walking meditation, one chooses a walking area, a level walking area, usually 25-30 paces long. And so one starts at one end and one just walks slowly and mindfully. It doesn't have to be extremely slowly. Within the forest traditions, they don't emphasize this very slow style of walking meditation, but walking at slightly slower than normal pace. And one just is aware of each step as one takes it. Right, left, right, left. And in this way, the mindfulness is operating almost exactly as it does when one is mindful of the breath. When one is practicing mindfulness of breathing, one is aware of in-breath, out-breath, in-breath, out-breath, in, out. And now one has changed the posture. And so when walking, one doesn't try to be mindful of the breath, but one is mindful of right step, left, right, left, right, left. So it's the mindfulness is operating in exactly the same way, just that the object has changed. Then when one comes to the end of the walkway, then one stops and stands still. Now one knows one is standing still. Then one turns around. One could say that this is a position in between standing and walking. So as one is turning, one is aware of turning around. When one completes the turn, then momentarily one is aware of standing still. And just for a moment one observes the body as it's standing still. Then one starts to walk in the other direction. Again, mindful, aware, right step, left step, right step, left step, till one comes to the end of the walkway. Again, one stops, mindful of standing still. Mindfully, one turns around. Mindfully, one stands still. Then, mindfully, one walks right, left, right, left, right, left. Doing this back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes people think that the only serious meditation is sitting meditation, and that when one is doing this walking meditation, it's just an exercise for making the legs limber so that one could go back and get to the real work of the sitting meditation. But within practice traditions, or at least some practice traditions, this isn't the case. But the walking meditation can be practiced. When it's practiced continuously, it becomes a very powerful practice in itself. Because in this practice, one is developing the mindfulness and clear comprehension to the act of walking and maintaining that mindfulness and clear comprehension continuously. And so as one continues with this practice over time, that mindfulness and knowledge or comprehension are building up momentum so that one can be observing the body at very subtle levels, even microscopic levels, within the act of walking. And then naturally, as one starts observing the body at subtler levels, naturally one starts to walk more slowly, because one is now able to attend to the bodily processes with each step at finer levels. And so some teachers this is especially within the tradition of the Burmese Vipassana practice, teach that after one gets a clear awareness of the walking step by step, then one breaks up the step or divides it into stages. One might, for example, divide the step into 3 stages: picking up the foot, pushing it forward, putting it down. And so now one tries to distinguish within each step these 3 phases: picking, pushing, putting. Sometimes it can be a 4th phase can be added. As one shifts, shifts the attention from one foot to the next in order to take the next step, one presses down on the foot that one has just put down. And so now we have 4 phases: picking, pushing, putting, pressing. Each one begins with P to make it simple. And so one attends now with each step to these 4 phases. Then some teachers add that as one takes each step, before one makes any move, one notes the intention to make that move. So before picking the foot up, one notes that there's the intention of picking the foot, then the act of picking it up. Before pushing the foot forward, there's the intention to push the foot forward, then the act of pushing it forward. Then the intention to put the foot down, then the act of putting it down. Then the intention to press the foot down, then the actual act of pressing the foot down. And then with the next step, say the left step, again we have these 8 phases. Intention to pick up, picking. Intention to push, pushing. Intention to put down, putting. Intention to press, pressing. And so now, in one step, there's 8 activities to note. And there's this alternation of the mental phase and the physical phase. And so now one is seeing how experience, any active experience, has this dual aspect, bodily aspect and mental aspect. And what is happening by breaking the step up into these phases, well, one thing that one is able to observe is the dual aspect of experience, the physical aspect and the mental aspect, both joined together, sort of indissolubly, inseparably united. And also one is seeing the temporal aspect of experience, how experience can be, at least mentally, dissected into different phases that succeed one another in time. And so what is this bringing to the forefront of one's attention? What is now becoming manifest as one is observing succeeding phases?
Dependent origination.
Not dependent origination. You could say arising and passing away, actually that's good, but something more general. Impermanence. Because each of these occurs and then it's replaced by the next. We could also say that this is arising and vanishing, arising and stopping. Because the act of picking up, it stops, it's replaced by pushing forward. The pushing stops, it's replaced by putting down. The putting down stops, it's replaced by pressing. And then when one adds in the intentional aspect, then one gets each one succeeded by the intention. Okay, and so when one is practicing in this way, just to take 25 steps, maybe to go from here, about 2/3 of the way across this hall, might take a person an hour. Okay, but when one practices the walking meditation, that's the way particular way it's developed within what's called the Burmese Vipassana method. But in the Thai forest tradition, the walking meditation is done at a fairly normal pace, a little slower than normal. But when one sustains the walking meditation, continues it for a long period, and one is doing it several times a day, every day, then the attention could become very refined so that one is able to observe the process of arising and passing away, even when walking at a fairly normal pace. Okay, so then he dwells in this way, contemplating the body and the body internally. Say that's focusing on his own experience. Externally, I mean, one doesn't look up sort of to see what others are doing, but one becomes aware that one could do this reflectively, that others are engaged in these postures of either walking, standing, sitting, or lying down. Or both. Then one is able to observe the arising factors, the vanishing factors, both, and so on, as previously explained. Okay, now I'll go immediately now into what is called the practice of clear comprehension. Okay, this seems somewhat similar to observation of the four postures, but what seems to me to be the case is that in the practice of clear comprehension, first there's a broader range. One is now being aware not just of the postures themselves, but of various activities that take place. And so the postures themselves, even though they're mentioned, or some of the actions are mentioned within clear comprehension, but they are now subsidiary, they play a subsidiary role to clearly comprehending the various activities in which one engages in the course of the day. Earlier, when we explained the shorter discourse on the elephant's footprint, I explained that the commentators analyze clear comprehension into four aspects. There is the clear comprehension of one's purpose, clear comprehension of what's suitable, clear comprehension of the meditation object, which means keeping the meditation object continuously present to the mind, and then clear comprehension of non-delusion, which is the clear comprehension that is exercised in the practice of insight. Okay, when the commentators explain this passage here, they apply each of these four types of clear comprehension. I won't go into a detailed explanation, but okay, when we take the case of clear comprehension when going forward and returning, then one would understand what is one's purpose in going someplace. When returning, what is my purpose? Again, when looking ahead, when looking to the side, one does all of these actions not just automatically and mechanically, but aware of the purpose in acting. Okay, then this clear comprehension becomes extended even to actions like, since it's explaining for a monk, putting on the robes, carrying the alms bowl, then in a general way when eating, drinking, chewing, tasting, even when going to the toilet, defecating and urinating, then when walking, standing, sitting, those are the main postures, when lying down before one has fallen asleep, then as soon as one wakes up, the clear comprehension returns, when speaking, when keeping silent, when stopping, when speaking. When engaged in all of these activities, there is this clear comprehension of one's purpose. And then when engaged in the meditation practice, one tries to maintain a continuity of awareness of the meditation object. And if it's a meditation object that one can't maintain within the midst of all of these activities, then one applies the clear comprehension simply to the activity in which one is engaged. So, for example, if one is practicing mindfulness of breathing, then when mealtime comes, one doesn't try to be attentive to the breath when one is eating the meal, because that will make the mind very tired, trying to focus on the breath when eating. But instead, one applies the clear comprehension to the act of eating. And so one becomes attentive to each aspect of the act of eating. When taking the food, lifting the food to the mouth, putting the food in the mouth, chewing, swallowing, when tasting the food, swallowing, then when taking the next spoonful, lifting, putting in the mouth, chewing, tasting, swallowing. if one takes a drink, lifting the cup or glass, tilting it back, absorbing the liquid, tasting, swallowing. And so one maintains this continuity of awareness in each activity. After the meal, one goes to brush the teeth, one is aware of opening the tube of toothpaste, squeezing the toothpaste, putting it on the toothbrush, putting the toothbrush to the mouth, brushing the teeth, then spitting out the toothpaste, rinsing the mouth. Okay, so the clear comprehension applies to all these activities. Then when one comes into the stage of insight practice, then one becomes aware in all of these activities that these are just bodily and mental processes which are occurring on their own, interdependently, through conditions, that they're subject to arising and to vanishing, and that there's nobody, no subject, no agent, no substantial self which is performing them. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions. Yeah, okay, now that's the microphone.
I have a question about the specific meaning of going forward and returning. Does that apply specifically to going out for alms rounds, or is it just a more general daily activity?
I would understand it in a more general activity, in a more general sense, as any daily activity. More questions? Okay, if there's no questions, then we go on to the next section. Okay, this is now called sometimes it's called the Patikula Sanya, the Patikula Sanya, the perception of the unattractive nature of the body, Asubha Sanya, almost the same meaning. And this is the meditation on the body that's particularly prescribed as the antidote for sensual craving or sensual lust. And so in the practice of this meditation, one takes the body and one examines the body in terms of its constituents in order to see that when one takes these particular parts of the body individually, then they are unattractive, not really particularly appealing. And so then sort of by inference, one knows that when one takes the body collectively as the compound whole, because each of the parts is unattractive, then the whole body cannot be attractive. And so here the formula goes that a monk reviews the same body is actually referring to his own body. He reviews the same body up from the soles of the feet, moving upwards to the top of the head, and down from the top of the hairs, moving downwards all the ways to the feet, bounded by skin, as full of many kinds of impurity thus. And here by impurity is not meant a kind of moral impurity. It just means something which is unattractive when one examines it individually. And so one observes in this body It's one's own body. There are head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, and so on. Okay, now the way this meditation is taught systematically, the parts, we have 31 parts, and of these 31 parts, I think 20 or 19 are solid parts, and 12 are liquid parts. And so we have these 31 parts, and these 31 parts are put into different groups. And so to get familiar with the meditation, one runs through them in groups, going in direct order and reverse order. And so first one takes the first 5 parts, which are the parts that whenever one perceives another body, what one perceives are these 5 parts. So these 5 parts are the head hairs, the body hairs, the nails, the teeth, and the skin. And one goes through them, going from head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin. Then one goes in reverse order. Skin, teeth, nails, body hair, head hair. Then one goes in forward order. Head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin. Then one brings in the next group. Flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow. Then one goes in reverse order. Bone marrow, bones, sinews, and flesh. Then again in direct order. Flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow. Then to the next group. Kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs. Then from lungs back to kidneys, from kidneys forward to lungs. Then the next group, intestines, mesentery. Mesentery is a kind of tissue that holds the intestines, that ties the intestines in place. Intestines, mesentery, stomach, feces. Then the commentaries add another part, the brain. Okay, then from the brain back to the intestines, from intestines forward to brain. Then one goes into the liquid parts of the body. Bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat. From fat back to bile, bile up to fat. Then on to tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, and urine. From urine back to tears, from tears to urine. Okay, then they recommend going through in this sequence over and over. Once one gets familiar, then one can go in direct order all the ways from head hairs to urine, then from urine back to head hairs, from head hairs forward to urine, going through the parts over and over. The commentaries give a very detailed way of explaining this. In my opinion, they make it, I have to say, too complicated. But I think if one just takes each part and one focuses in on trying to get a perception of the unattractive nature of that part, and one does this going through all of the parts, and if one wants to practice this seriously as a special meditation object, if one doesn't have medical training, what is useful is to borrow a medical textbook. Now you don't even have to do that on the internet. You could probably find some website that will show you these parts of the body. Of course, in order to get really the impression of the unattractive nature of the part, it's useful either to observe open surgery, open body surgery, or to go to a morgue to observe an autopsy. I don't know if they will allow an ordinary person in this country. In Sri Lanka, since it's predominantly a Buddhist country, they will let the monks come in to observe the autopsies. So in this way, one gets the perception of the actual bodily part itself, and then one goes through these parts, all of them, till one gets a general familiarity with all 32 parts. And then what's recommended, in order to get the clear perception of the unattractiveness, certain parts will stand out, others will be a little bit vague. At a certain point, one starts dropping, omitting the vague parts, and just retaining the more prominent parts, until one can simplify this meditation down to maybe 5 prominent unattractive parts. One way that's actually suggested, I think this comes in the Digha Nikaya, is just using skin, flesh, blood, and bone. I think using those 4 parts would be sufficient. Skin, flesh or muscles, bone, blood and bone. Okay, then we have a simile. This is as if there was a bag with an opening at both ends, full of many kinds of grain: hill rice, red rice, beans, peas, millet, and white rice. And then a man with good eyes were to open it, and then he would be able to look at these different types of grain. This is hill rice, this red rice, these are the beans, these are peas, this millet, this is white rice. And in the same way, the meditator reviews, examines this body as full of these many kinds of impurities. Okay, so initially the focus is on one's own body. But then when one gets the perception of the impure nature, the unattractive nature of one's own body, then one can reflect on the bodies of others. But it's not wise, say, for a male to choose a beautiful young female, or for a female, a woman to choose a beautiful young man. But one just takes a general person representing another human being, should be of one's own sex, and then one observes that body, dissects it into its constituent parts in the same way that one dissects one's own body. And one sees that this other body is also constituted of the same parts, the same 31, 32 parts. Okay, and then one does this internally and externally. And then one goes through the same series of stages with all of the different phases of the refrain. Okay, now I'll move on directly to the next subsection. This is concerned with another way to observe the body. Now one is observing the body in terms of its elements, the bodily elements. And according to the Buddhist way of contemplation, the Buddhist method of contemplation, all of physical nature can be analyzed into 4 elements. Some of you have just emerged, maybe a couple of weeks ago, from the 4 Elements meditation course taught by Venerable Dhammadipa. So this will sound very familiar to you. Maybe some will say a little too familiar. Okay, so the four elements that constitute all of nature are called, following the traditional names, the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. And now when applying this contemplation, one applies it not to the external world, but one applies it to one's own body. And now there are different ways that the Buddha has taught the contemplation on the elements. There is the longer, more detailed method, which is usually more suitable for beginners. In that method, one dissects the body into the different organs and tissues, very similar to the way it's done in the contemplation of the unattractiveness of the body. One takes 12 parts of the body to represent the earth element. Those are all the parts from the head hairs through the feces, then adding the brain. Okay, so these 12 parts, the earth element is more prominent, and so one takes these parts, these organs and tissues, to represent the earth element. In the next 12 parts, the liquid or water element is more prominent, and so one takes them to represent the liquid element. That is the parts from bile through to urine. Then the explanation adds certain aspects of the fire element, that which by the body is warmed, keeping it at its normal temperature, that by which it becomes feverish, that's when the body temperature increases, that is the result of hyperactivity of the fire element, that by which the body matures or grows older, that's considered to be the work of the fire element, the decay of the body. And then that by which the food that one eats is digested, because digestion is oxidation, which is exactly what takes place when something burns. Okay, so these are the aspects of the bodily function in which the fire element is prominent. And so one takes them as representing the fire element. And then the air element is represented by certain bodily processes. It's explained as upgoing winds, downgoing winds. The winds that course through all of the limbs. It seems to me that, this is my opinion, that ancient Indian physiology understood what we would call neurological processes as being the function of the air element. That we could say what we now call motor activity and sensory activities, sensory nerve processes and motor sensory processes, motor processes were considered to be functions of the air element. And even when one moves the body, this is considered to occur through the activation of the air element, since the air element is responsible for motion. Since when the wind blows, everything moves. And so similarly, when we move the limbs, when we move our body, that motion is occurring through the activation of the air element. And then there's the air in the stomach, the air in the intestines, and in-breathing and out-breathing. Those are the examples of the activity, those are examples of the air element. So that is a more elaborate explanation of the four elements. And when one practices the meditation on the four elements in that more elaborate way, then one goes mentally through all of these different bodily tissues, bodily fluids, bodily functions, in order to see them as representing the four elements. But now, when we assign particular bodily organs and tissues to one or another of the four elements, this is done as a kind of generalization. But actually, according to the deeper Buddhist analysis, every molecule of the body, every cell of the body, every molecule is constituted out of the four elements. And so the four elements are really present in all of these tissues, all of these organs, all of these fluids. So what is it that actually distinguishes the four elements? What distinguishes them are particular functions or particular qualities. We call these the distinctive qualities and distinctive functions. And so the earth element is the quality of solidity, the quality by reason of which matter occupies space and obstructs or prevents other matter from occupying the same space. And then when the earth element is taken up as an object of meditation, it is to be identified or recognized by its distinctive quality, which is that of hardness or solidity. In a more detailed way, in the explanation of the earth element, this is according to the Pa-Auk Sayadaw method, which is strongly rooted in the Abhidharma. The earth element is taken to have actually 12 characteristics? No, 6 characteristics. These are 3 contrasting pairs. Hardness or softness, roughness or smoothness, and heaviness or lightness. If one has been practicing that way, continue to practice. It seems to me that's a little bit too complicated for ordinary practice. One can recognize the presence of the earth element simply by taking the aspect of hardness or solidity in the body. And that solidity is present even in the fluid elements, or in the fluids of the body. There's still some degree of solidity, and that is the earth element. Okay, then the water element or liquid element has the characteristic that's said of oozing or flowing. And according to the Abhidhamma, it's also said that the water element has the characteristic of binding or cohesion, since it's liquid that makes the solid particles of matter stick together, bind together, cohere. Maybe at the microatomic level, the water element will correspond to what are called the gluons. Maybe the earth element are the quarks. There are said to be these 2 types of subatomic particles. the quarks and the gluons. The gluons hold the quarks together. Okay, and so one can experience the liquid element, the water element in the body, either through the characteristic of the flowing or oozing, or I would even say the characteristic of moisture, since one experiences moisture throughout the body. Even in the hard parts like the teeth or the nails, there's still some moisture there. That's the water element. But it's more evident in things like the blood, sweat, urine. Or else one can experience the water element through the cohesion of the particles of the body together. When this attention or mindfulness becomes very refined, one could experience how the body holds together, all of the parts binding together into the body. So that is the working of the water element. The two characteristics of flowing or moisture and the characteristic of cohesion. Then the fire element is what has the characteristic of heat. That's the more prominent characteristic. But it's also said one can experience the fire element as either heat or coolness. Coolness is relative absence of the fire element, whereas heat is the presence or concentration of the fire element. And then the air element or wind element is to be experienced as, we could say, is pressure, as distension. If one pays attention to the body, say, in the act of breathing, one experiences motion, that's the expansion or distension of the lungs. And then as the lungs expand, one experiences a pressure. That pressure or pressing is the activity of the air element. The air element is also said to be that which upholds the body. Since I think the idea is that just as when we fill a balloon with air, the balloon expands and also tends to move upwards. And so it's through the air element that the body is lifted up, and also the air element explains expansion, or maybe we could say expansion and contraction as the activity or manifestation of the air element. Okay, so when one is practicing the contemplation of the elements, the investigation of the elements in this concise way, one doesn't analyze the body into the different parts, head hairs, body hairs, and so on, but one simply gets the sense of the characteristics of these four elements. The characteristic of hardness or solidity in the case of the earth element, the characteristic of moisture or flowing in the case of, or cohesion in the case of the water element, the sense of heat or cold for the fire element, and the sense of pressure, distension, expansion, contraction in the case of the air element. And then one runs through the whole body from the top of the head to the soles of the feet, up and down, examining the body, experiencing it in terms of these four elements. Okay, then this is illustrated by the simile of a skilled butcher or his apprentice takes a cow. Now when we look at it, we have the immediate impression that is a cow. But the butcher takes the cow, he kills it, and then he cuts up the cow into pieces, different cuts of the cow. And then he's going to market them at an open market on the crossroads. And so one has different cuts of the cow, cuts of beef. What are they? Sirloin steak, tenderloin steak, prime ribs. I don't know the other cuts. But anyway, when he has these different cuts of beef for sale on the market, when somebody comes by and looks at them, they don't think, oh, that's cow, but they think this is sirloin steak, that's tenderloin, this is prime ribs, this is roast beef, and so on. So they think in terms of what are the different pieces of meat that they can purchase and use. The perception of cow has vanished. Right? And so that is what happens when one applies the contemplation of the elements to the body. One examines the body in terms of the four elements, and then the perception of I, mine, myself disappears in regard to the body. Instead, one perceives the body as just a combination of these four elements. Okay, now we'll move to what are called the 9 charnel ground contemplations. These are divided into 9 separate exercises because to each one there is attached this refrain about contemplating the body and the body internally and externally and so on. But it seems to me that the best way to do this exercise is to join the 9 together into a sequence so that one obtains a perception of the gradual disintegration of the body. I think perhaps that is the way this was originally taught, but then the later compilers of the text, in order to make it more complex, they inserted that refrain in between each stage, and in that way obtained 9 separate contemplations. We have to remember, in the Buddha's time, bodies of the dead, probably more eminent people in society, were cremated or maybe even buried. And so their bodies would become no longer perceptible. But ordinary people, when they died, there would be some place an area in the woods that would be cleared, and this would be the charnel ground. And when people died, the body would be brought to the charnel ground and simply discarded there. And when this is done, then different birds of prey would come, different predators would come and devour the remains of the body. And so it would be easy for a courageous monk who wants to do this meditation to go out to the charnel ground and observe the body in different stages of decay. Okay, so now one goes, but this is an important point in doing this meditation. The Pali uses the phrase for each exercise that begins sayatapi, which is translated here as though he were to see. Sayatapi paseya, as though he were to see. And so, even though some monks would actually go to the charnel ground in order to see the body. To practice the exercise, it's not necessary to actually see it. But that phrase, sayatapi, just as though he were to see, gives an opening to perform these exercises through one's imagination. Thus, one begins as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, 1, 2, or 3 days dead. Under that condition, it becomes bloated, livid, kind of bluish color, and oozing matter. So first one gains that perception of the body in this first stage of decay. Then one compares one's own body to it thus. That's the important point. Upasangharati. One compares one's own body with it thus. This body too is of the same nature, it will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. In this way he dwells, contemplating the body and the body internally, externally, and both. What's interesting here, for this exercise, one begins with the external body, and then one applies it to one's own body internally. Whereas the other exercises begin with the internal body, one's own body, and then one moves to the body externally. So one takes the body internally, externally, and both. Now we come to the other stages of decay. He sees the corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, now being devoured by different predators, crows, hawks, vultures, dogs, jackals, or various other creatures, different kinds of worms. And so one reflects on one's own body. This body too is of the same nature. Okay, then the rest just takes the body through the other stages of decay. The skeleton with flesh and blood still on it, held together with sinews. Then the flesh is gone, but there's still some blood stains on it, held together with sinews. Then the skeleton without flesh, the blood is all gone, held together with sinews. Then somehow, I don't know how, but the sinews break apart and then the bones get scattered in the different directions. Then next, paragraph 26 to 30, one sees the bones bleached white, the color of shells. Then the bones are heaped up. How do they get heaped up? I don't know. But that's what's said. The bones more than a year old, rotten and crumbled to dust. Okay, and then one compares one's own body to this thus. This body too is of the same nature, will be like that. It's not exempt from that fate. And then one comes to the refrain, all of the different aspects that I explained earlier. Okay, at this point then, we've completed going through the mindfulness of the body, and now I'll ask whether there's any questions. Please. Okay, you could use this amplifier.
Yeah, I have a question about the order. It seems like these progress from sort of the coarse to the more subtle.
In the stages of decay or the meditation?
Overall, from the state of the body, awareness, contemplation of the body.
Yeah.
Except that it seems like the elements is a pretty nuanced contemplation, whereas the contemplation of a body decaying seems not as subtle.
This is the way I would understand it. I explained last week that there are two Chinese versions of the Satipatthana Sutta. In both of them begin with the contemplation of the four postures, then come to clear comprehension, and then have come to mindfulness of breathing. So the way I see it there, one begins with the coarser practices, which is being mindful of the body and the different postures, having comprehension of the different activities. So this is the way one is developing mindfulness and clear comprehension in everyday life. One has not yet come to a sitting meditation practice. Then, with the mindfulness of breathing, that is the first sitting meditation practice that one undertakes. And then this is my interpretation, through the mindfulness of breathing, one learns how to settle the mind down, to collect it, to focus it. Of course, one can move directly from there to insight and to the stages of insight knowledge. But also one could use that calm, centered mind as a means for investigation. So then one investigates the body from these two different angles while it's alive. First in terms of the unattractiveness, then in terms of the elements. So those are two aspects of the living body. And then it seems to me the natural place to put the contemplation of a decaying body is at the end. It would be a little bit out of sequence to have contemplation of a decaying body earlier, then one comes back to the living body. Somebody might say, hey, you're dead already. How have you come back to life again? Then between the two, we call this the analytical meditations of the living body, the investigation in terms of the unattractiveness of the body, this, it seems to me, is coarser than the observation of the elements. And so one would begin with that and then move into the elements. And also if one is doing the more elaborate contemplation of the elements, if one has already done the contemplation on unattractiveness, then one has covered 32 of the 42 parts of the ground. What percentage that comes out to? Somebody who's good in quick arithmetic can tell us. But it's about 2/3 of the way one is already there. 3/4 of the way one is already there. So one just has to throw in the fire element and the air element, and one's got it all covered. But then just coming back, what seems to me, perhaps the Pali tradition put the mindfulness of breathing first with the thought that at the outset, this is the meditation that one does at the beginning. Then one isn't sitting in meditation all the time. So when one is getting acquainted with the meditative mind, then when one moves out of the meditation into one's movements around, about in day-to-day life, one knows what it is like to be mindful, so one can apply that mindfulness to the postures. And then the knowing that occurs in mindfulness of breathing, one can apply to the everyday activities, so one has clear comprehension covered. So these are conjectures that explain the order.
Sunday, in order to establish mindfulness in the body, does one need to practice all of the exercises?
Not at all. The usual way is just to select one meditation practice that one finds particularly congenial to oneself. Though it's useful, of course, if one chooses one sitting meditation practice, to also have, especially when one is practicing in a retreat situation where one wants to maintain continuity of practice, one should also have the mindfulness directed to the four postures, and then in one's regular activities one should have the clear comprehension. But of the sitting meditations, one should just choose the one that one finds particularly congenial. Though some people will move among several meditation practices for different purposes, but at the outset I would say base oneself upon one, the one that one finds most congenial. And I wanted to add also, I just thought, this is concerning Anapanasati, that many people have found, myself too, that mindfulness of breathing is really a very subtle meditation subject. And so one shouldn't be misled by the fact that it's placed early in the sutta to think that it's an easy meditation subject, a basic meditation subject, something for beginners. The way I would see it, one uses mindfulness of meditation, mindfulness of breathing, as a kind of blank screen to perceive how one's mind works, to see what are the particular kilesas or defilements that are strong within oneself, what kind of thoughts, emotions, feelings arise regularly and repeatedly. Then when one gets an idea of how one's mind works, then one knows what other meditations one should use from time to time in order to counteract those afflictive or defiled tendencies. For example, one meditator might see that sensual thoughts are often arising. And so that person might know that it's useful to practice the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body. Somebody else will often have angry or thoughts of hatred and ill will towards others. That type of person, it's useful to practice loving kindness meditation. Another person might go about life not angry towards other people, but a kind of feeling of just resentment to the way things work out. For this person, maybe the meditation on the elements is useful to give a sense of the impersonality of processes.
I have a follow-up question. Without considering the practices we did in the past life and the continuing impact of this life, can the practice of concentrating on the unattractiveness of the body by itself support jhana?
Support what?
Jhana.
The attainment of jhana. It's said that the attainment of the unattractive nature of the body is capable of leading to the first jhana. The way this works, as one goes through the bodily parts, one simplifies and reduces to the point where one just has one particular part of the body that one chooses as the meditation object. So it just comes down to that one point, and then one focuses exclusively upon that one part of the body. And then, because one has just taken one part, one is able to gain jhana on that particular part. But because this distinctive characteristic one is focusing on is unattractiveness, it doesn't pull the mind in and up to the higher jhanas. And so the highest jhana one could attain is the first jhana.
Can you explain that a bit? Why doesn't it pull the mind in?
I said it doesn't pull the mind up to the higher jhanas because the characteristic is asubha, the unattractive nature. And so it's not something which is appealing. Somehow it's able to serve as a basis for jhana, but it doesn't lead to the higher jhanas. This is what is said in the Visuddhimagga.
Then how about the concentration on the elements?
The contemplation on the elements does not lead to any of the jhanas. The most it leads to is what is called the access concentration. Or let's say that leads to a degree of concentration that's the equivalent of access concentration. Because with the contemplation of the elements, one is observing things that are actually existent phenomena, one is not just pulling out from the object something that can generate the counterpart sign, that nimitta which is the object of the jhana. But one is focusing on the actual characteristics of phenomena. And then with the contemplation of the elements, one is moving through the four elements. And one is moving through the four elements. Bach is better. One is moving through the four elements. And so one has different characteristics that one is focusing on.
But it is good for insight.
Yeah. The four elements meditation is the particular specific meditation for developing the insight on the nature of the body, the nature of material phenomena.
I'm thinking about non-self.
For non-self, the contemplation of the elements is, you could say, the king of meditation subjects, at least with regard to material phenomena. Okay, Bowie?
My question is about the refrain. It belongs to the Vipassana part, right? So by attaching it to each section, does that mean each section alone is sufficient for the practitioner to achieve the final goal?
Say again, I'm not really sure I caught this.
My question is about the refrain.
Yeah.
The refrain belongs to
the refrain, okay.
Right, it belongs to Vipassana, right?
Right.
So by attaching it to each subcategory, does that mean each subcategory is sufficient for the practitioner to achieve the final goal?
Okay, I understand that now. Yeah, each of these meditation subjects is said to be sufficient for the practitioner to achieve the final goal, because each one could be steered off in the direction of vipassana practice, of insight practice. So even something that mindfulness of breathing, though it leads to jhana, but shifting it away from that one-pointed concentration of mind, shifting it away from that to, say, the observation of arising and vanishing, then one is moving into the insight knowledge of arising and vanishing. And then from there one can move through the higher and higher stages of insight knowledge till one makes the breakthrough to the world transcending insights, world transcending realizations. Yeah, so each can lead to the final goal.
Does the Chinese version also have the refrain attached?
Wait, now, give her the amplifier again.
I just have a quick question. Does the Chinese version also have the refrain attached to each subcategory?
I believe so, but I haven't looked at it in a while. Okay, Barbara has.
I have a question.
Wow, you. Yeah.
I have a question about the word unattractive, and I'd be interested in more on the word in the Pali, because to me that's always connoted some variant of ugly.
Yeah.
And as I listen to you go through the meditation,
Yeah.
it strikes me that what it really is doing is breaking down the clinging and attachment.
Exactly, yeah.
Moving towards neutrality.
Yeah.
So that may also connect with what she's saying. So that if I were to be thinking instead of unattractive,
Right.
of neutral, that would fit with what the original intent was.
Yeah, the actual word itself in Pali is asubha, which means literally non-beautiful, not beautiful. And so one of the, we call the triggers for sensual desire is called subhanimitta, which means the appearance as beautiful. And so what one does is to take what normally appeals to one as beautiful, which is the physical body, though one doesn't begin with the physical body of a beautiful person, but one takes one's own body and then one observes how these different constituents of the body, when one looks at them objectively, are not beautiful.
But it's not necessarily, because often it has often sounded to me in the past to be cultivating aversion.
No,
And I don't
the
think
aversion
that's
is actually the wrong response.
Yeah.
Some people cultivate it in that way, but that's said to be the wrong way of cultivating it. The idea is really to break down the perception of the body as beautiful. And so one examines the part in order to see what it's really like when one looks at it close up. Okay, I think we'll have to break here. Oh,
I have a question.
yeah.
Always there's one of the methods, we pick one of the practice and reach the final goal.
Right.
Once we reach the final goal, if a different person can take a different method
Yeah.
and reach the final goal.
Yeah.
And the third person does the same thing to the final goal. Once any of these three reach the final goal, if they come back and switch the method, they will understand exactly the same.
After they reach the final goal, of course, they could take up another method just maybe to see what it's like. But in a way, there's nothing further to understand through that method and no further final goals. They don't have to reach the final goal again through the other meditation subject.
It will gain the knowledge or wisdom or insight that applies to all.
Yeah, they all eventually converge on the same realizations. Okay, so
Just ask about scheduling. This is the last class for this year.
okay, a good question. Yeah, this is the last class for this year, but I will give the class through the winter. So I will start again on January 10th. Then not the 17th, but the 24th. Then I'll try to do 3 per month. 24th, 31st. I will put up through the BAUS, everybody who's on the BAUS mailing list, I will have the schedule put up and then hand it out the first class when we come back. But the next class will be January 10th. And I'll finish then going through the Satipatthana Sutta. Next time I'll do the contemplation of feelings and the contemplation of mind section. And then the class after that, I'll do the contemplation of Dhammas section, probably all in one, because some of those sections will be dealt with more elaborately when we come to the chapter on wisdom, so I don't have to deal with them elaborately under the Satipatthana Sutta. Okay, so let us then end with the sharing of the merits. Just that, is everybody registered with BAUS so that you would get the mailing about the next class in the next schedule? If you're not registered, maybe you could give your name and address, email address to Venerable Sudama. She's sitting back there. And she'll add it to the mailing list. Okay, so we share the merits with the Devas, the Nagas, the dragon spirits, the Bhutas, the fierce spirits, asking them to rejoice in these merits, to protect the Buddha teaching, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang Etavatacha Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Devanumodantu together Sabbe Danumodantu Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Vichihitato Etantare Satakaya Upapanna Rupi Arupicha Asanya Sanyino Dukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibutin